The next speaker is so distinguished. It will, of course, take me a while to read out his introduction, though he per se needs no introduction because he is someone who is internationally recognized leader on environmental and energy issues. I'm talking, of course, about Dr. R.K. Pachauri, who's been serving as the chairperson of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change IPCC, which won and was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007 during his tenure. Dr. Pachauri has also been the Director General of TERI, the Research and Policy Organization of our country, and Chancellor of TERI University, besides being the Chairman of the Governing Council of the National Agro Foundation, as well as the Chairman of the Board of Columbia University's International Research Institute for Climate and Society. Spoken, as we all know, about climate change. Born in Nainital, he was educated at La Martinia College in Lucknow, and interestingly began his career with the Indian Railways. Luckily for us, though, he made the switch to the world of environment, and he is a strict vegetarian, largely because of the environmental and climate change implications. Many of you would have also read about the report in the papers recently, calling for his periodic review of national targets as a must for climate action for countries, he said. And in fact, the Hindu went on to quote, "The Dr. Pachauri has said adaptation measures to deal with changing climate are neglected not only at the international level, but also at the national level." Ladies and gentlemen, aren't we glad that we have the conscience keeper of the world of environment right in our midst here this afternoon? Please put your hands together to welcome Dr. R.K. Pachauri.
Shri Prashant Bhushan, Professor B.S. Satyanarayan, Professor Subhash Pandey, Professor K.N. Rajarao, Professor Pushpa Agarwal, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. I, of course, feel very humble over here after Mr. Prashant Bhushan has spoken, because he said it all and he's put it within a context which I think is relevant to the little that I was going to say. And I also want to emphasize the fact that he's really a one-man army. And you mentioned the Nobel Peace Prize. I received it on behalf of the scientific community, the IPCC. And therefore, I am really coasting on the glory that belongs to others. But Mr. Prashant Bhushan, as I said, is a one-man army. And it's a good thing that I can regard him as a friend, because I wouldn't want to be on the other side. Because if I was, I probably wouldn't be standing here before you. I would have been lying down long ago, being knocked out. The way he's knocked out several vested interests and has been able to safeguard the interests of the public and society at large. Well, I'm basically going to give you a very quick presentation because I know we are behind time and I don't want to prolong this presentation, but this is based essentially on the last report that we have brought out, the synthesis report, which is the final product of the 5th assessment report of the IPCC. And let me just say a little bit about the IPCC. This particular report is the direct effort of over 800 scientists who have written the report, but there's a much larger number that has provided inputs, because we also have a category called contributing authors. And what are contributing authors? They are specialists in some specific form of science that has direct relevance to the entire report as a whole. So just to give you an example, somebody may be a specialist on ocean acidification and what's causing it. And that person, as a contributing author, will write something and give it to this body of 800 plus authors, and that's taken into account. More than that, at every stage of the drafting of the report, we have a large number of expert reviewers who go through the report and provide comments to the authors. And these comments, in the course of the fifth assessment report have totaled something like 150,000 comments, close to that. And these, each one of them has to be taken into account. And the authors have to record whether they accept a comment or reject it. If they reject it, they have to give reasons. And all of this is available on the website. So it's a very transparent process. And those who question the process are clearly in the category that Mr. Prashant Bhushan talked about, those who are connected with some interest or the other which would like to question the science. But I think in any endeavor where you're bringing out new knowledge, clearly it's not going to be accepted overnight, because it clearly requires changes, it requires shifts in perceptions, in strategies, in actions, and it would be totally unrealistic on anybody's part to believe that whatever the IPCC produces will be accepted immediately. But the good news is, I've never seen the level of awareness that has been created now. The 20th Conference of the Parties under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was held earlier this month in Lima, Peru. And I was quite amazed at the level of awareness, the understanding, and the professed commitment on the part of all the negotiators over there to take action on the basis of the science that has been produced. And I'll give you a quick run through of these as I make my presentation. But let me make a general point. In this country, we have never really had a proper debate on what kind of economic structure, what kind of economic growth we really want in the interests of the people of this country. You know, in the initial stages, we were completely fascinated with the Soviet model, and therefore we had large public investments, and the consequences of that are now very well known. But once liberalization came in, we just completely followed the model that has been adopted in the countries of the West. And I think this has become so much a part of our thinking that we were discussing earlier, for instance, before coming to this particular session, about all the remarkable research that's being done by this institution. While at the same time we have the IITs, we have institutions of higher learning that clearly draw a lot of talent in the form of students and faculty. But I'm not too sure whether all the institutions, and I don't want to single out any particular one, but most institutions of higher learning, how much have they really contributed to the definition of economic strategy and articulation of the pathway that we should adopt in the interests of this country. In fact, the late Dr. Abid Hussain used to say that anyone who enters an IIT, his soul, the moment he enters the IIT, his soul has migrated to the US and his body follows 5 years later. So I'm afraid we are so caught up with the lure, with the glamour, or so-called glamour of the West, that there are very few people, silly people like me, who came back to this country after having studied overseas and having worked for a short while over there. And I think the lacuna has been that we have not really created the sense of excitement about building a new economic system, a new society. And Mr. Prashant Bhushan has been very articulate in presenting before you the externalities that the current pattern of development imposes on society, on the ecosystems of this planet, and on the very wealth of natural resources that this country has. And I would say that for that reason, Mahatma Gandhi's relevance is much higher today than it has been in the past. Because if we were doing the right thing, then I suppose we would have been essentially following what Mahatma Gandhi preached and practiced all his life. But the fact that we've deviated from it to such a large extent really means that the philosophy that Gandhiji put forward all through his life should draw us to a very different path of development. And in that context, can we continue to ignore climate change and its impacts? And the nexus between climate change and sustainable development is a very close one. So therefore, if we want to pursue sustainable development and make sure that this term inclusive growth, which every politician uses, is really implemented in spirit and content, then really speaking, we have to take climate change into account. And Gandhiji was once asked if he expected India to attain the same standard of living as Britain. And you know, he had this enormous power of wit and wisdom. He said it took Britain half the resources of the planet to achieve this prosperity. How many planets will a country like India require? But we are moving in the same direction. We are essentially going in the direction where, really speaking, we'll need a number of planets. And therefore, I think the issue of resource efficiency, the issue of using all the resources that we utilize in the process of economic development is a primary objective that we have to observe and pursue. Now, the key messages of the fifth assessment report are that human influence on the climate system is clear. The more we disrupt our climate, the more we risk severe, pervasive, and irreversible impacts. We have the means to limit climate change and build a more prosperous and sustainable society. So basically, dealing with climate change also gives us a whole range of co-benefits, including the development of a cleaner and more sustainable future. Excuse me. Now, one major finding that we came up with in the fifth assessment report is that it is extremely likely that we are the dominant cause of warming since the mid-20th century. And when we use the term extremely likely, we are assigning a probability of over 95%. So therefore, this is something that we need to take into account. And you see over here the increases in temperature that have taken place since the beginning of industrialization. And what's apparent is, since the middle of the last century, see the sharp increase that has taken place. Look at the trend, and it'll tell you very clearly how rapidly we have been increasing temperatures in the past 50 or 60 years. What's also important is to observe the fact that, based on records, the last 3 decades have been successively warmer than the previous one. And these 3 decades have been perhaps the warmest since 1850. I also want to highlight the fact that in this particular report, for the first time, we have provided a lot more knowledge on the oceans than we were able to in the past. You see over here, 90% of the energy accumulating in the climate system between 1971 and 2010 has accumulated in the oceans. So as a result, the oceans have now warmed to a depth of about 700 meters, and that has major implications for marine ecosystems and marine species of all kinds, including fish stock. The result of this is that fish stock, which existed in a certain part of this planet, have now actually moved, because clearly the change in climate is not conducive to their being able to survive, and therefore they have moved. And this has major implications for those whose lives and livelihoods are dependent on fishing and getting food from marine sources. Land temperatures remain at historic highs while ocean temperature continue to climb. And overall, if you look at the growth of greenhouse gas emissions between the year 2000 and 2010, that has been larger than in the previous 3 decades. And the rate of growth, if you look at these prominent gases that we have over here, these are F gases, these are essentially CFCs and so on, and nitrous oxide, methane, carbon dioxide from land use, carbon dioxide from fossil fuels and industrial processes, which is the largest chunk, as you would see over here, the yellow chunk. Now, since the year 2000, if you look at the trend in growth, it's been 2.2% per year. And prior to that, if you take the trend since, say, 1970, it was 1.3% per year. So, in other words, we are going in the wrong direction. We have had a UN Framework Convention on Climate Change in existence since 1992, but obviously we're ignoring it. And again, Gandhiji was right when he said speed is irrelevant, such as the growth of GDP. Speed is irrelevant if you're going in the wrong direction. I mean, if we are happy about GDP growth, which at the same time is imposing some major negative externalities on the environment, on society, then clearly that GDP growth is nothing to be all that proud about. Let me just give you some sources of emissions of greenhouse gases: 35% from the energy sector, 24% from agriculture, forestry and other land uses, 21% from industry, 14% from transport, and 6.4% from the building sector. So the energy sector is clearly something that requires urgent attention. Now, I'll just quickly run through these. This is, again, a plot of temperature going back to the beginning of industrialization. This is average sea level rise, and since the beginning of the last century, from 1900 to 2010, the increase has been an average of 19 centimeters. That's close to a foot. If you look at greenhouse gas concentrations of carbon dioxide, which is the green line, has risen very sharply. And this certainly goes against the interests of creating stability in the climate of this planet. If you look at carbon dioxide emissions, these are obviously of concern largely as they emanate from fossil fuels, cement and flaring. As far as forestry, that means deforestation, and other land use is concerned, there has been some improvement over here, but this may be temporary, and therefore clearly stopping deforestation is a very important part of the strategy. This is just a glimpse into the four diagrams that I just projected, and you can see visually at least what the correlation is in respect of increase in temperature, increase in concentrations of greenhouse gases, CO2 emissions, and sea level rise. Now, there are also changes in extreme weather, and these have taken place increasingly since 1950, particularly extreme precipitation events and heat waves. These are on the increase both in intensity and frequency. And impacts are already underway, as Mr. Prashant Bhushan said. Every part of the globe is affected by the impacts of climate change, from the tropics to the poles, on all continents and in the ocean, and it affects rich and poor countries alike. In fact, it's the poorest people, even in the rich countries, who become the worst victims of the impacts of climate change. But it's not as though any part of the globe is going to remain untouched by the impacts of climate change. What are the changes that manifest themselves? Oceans will continue to warm during the 21st century, and it's very likely that the Arctic sea ice cover will continue to shrink and thin as global mean surface temperatures rise. And I've been to the Arctic region several times, and I can tell you it's almost visible how the ice on the Arctic Ocean is melting rapidly. Global mean sea level will continue to rise during the 21st century, and of course global glacier volume will further decrease. This has implications for food and water shortages, increased poverty, increased displacement of people, and coastal flooding. Now, as it happens, if we want to limit temperature increase to 2 degrees Celsius by the end of this century, we have a total carbon budget, and of this 790 gigatons of carbon, we have already used up 515, and what's left is 275 gigatons. And therefore, if, let's say, the agreement that we hope to get in Paris at the end of next year is to ensure that temperature increase will not exceed 2 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, then all we have is this small budget of 275 gigatons of carbon. And this is where all the fighting between the developed and developing countries is taking place, because developing countries rightly argue that we need space to grow, and therefore you have to allow us increase in emissions, because the developed countries have already been through that phase. And the developed countries say, look, you are the ones who are going to contribute the maximum to future emissions, and therefore you have to be part of the solution as well. So hopefully this will get resolved, but it's a very contentious issue. And if we want to limit temperature increase to 2 degrees Celsius, then the world has to move very quickly in reducing emissions. And there are risks to food production. For instance, what is shown over here, all the brown and yellow shaded bars tell you about the negative impacts of climate change on agriculture. The blue one tells you about the improvements in yields. And that's because carbon dioxide is also a fertilizer, because it promotes photosynthesis. However, if you look at what would happen by the end of the century, then with the projected increase in temperature, if we don't do anything about this problem, you will have a very sharp reduction in the yields in agriculture, and that has serious implications for food security across the globe. Now, what can we do to limit temperature increase to 2 degrees Celsius? Well, there are lots of measures that can be adopted. Firstly, we have to adapt to the impacts of climate change, because even if we reduce emissions to zero today, climate change will continue for a few decades, and therefore we have no choice but to adapt to these. But adaptation alone will not be enough, because beyond a certain point, adaptation will become quite ineffective, and the impacts of climate change will cross certain thresholds or tipping points beyond which adaptation will not work. And therefore, we will very quickly have to start reducing emissions of greenhouse gases. That means we have to mitigate emissions of greenhouse gases. And delaying mitigation will substantially increase the challenges associated with limited warming to 2 degrees Celsius. And those challenges include higher costs. We need more efficient use of energy, greater use of low carbon and no carbon energy. And many of these technologies exist today. Renewable energy technologies, for instance, bioenergy, and of course there's need to develop carbon capture and storage and several other options. But that will only happen if we put in place a set of policies that bring about the research and development to take us in the direction that is required. And lifestyle and behavioral changes are also an important part of mitigation. And here I go back to what I said initially. We have adopted lifestyles and we have aspirations of lifestyles very similar to those that you have in the developed world. Is that really suitable for us? What about our own culture, our own tradition, our own philosophy? Should that not be an overriding factor in defining the kind of lifestyle that we should pursue? So these are issues that have to be resolved, particularly at the level of Indian society. And the cost of mitigation, of course there will be costs, but nothing substantial. You know, the economic growth will be reduced, as we have estimated, for a stringent mitigation pathway by no more than 0.06% of the GDP per year, or total consumption per year. So this only means that the sort of prosperity that we were to reach in 2030, for instance, may get postponed by a year or so. And that's clearly not a high price to pay for avoiding some of the worst impacts of climate change. And there are also many co-benefits from mitigation measures: much higher energy security, lower levels of air pollution at the local level, perhaps greater employment opportunities, and so on. And unmitigated climate change would create increasing risks to economic growth. So we have two sets of choices. We either go for a world which is there on the left-hand side. You know, the darker the shade over here, the higher the temperatures we would encounter at the end of, by the end of the century. So on the left-hand side, we have moderate increase in temperature, which perhaps we would be able to adapt to. On the right-hand side, you have a picture where we don't take any action today, and we would all be facing changes in climate that would be far beyond our ability to cope. Now, Albert Einstein was right when he said problems cannot be solved at the same level of awareness that created them. Today, we have the benefit of knowledge. This has been produced by the scientific community of the world, and I have absolutely no hesitation in saying that our fifth assessment report is the strongest, most compelling assessment of the science of climate change that has been produced. It is by far the largest piece of peer-reviewed scientific material that has been put forward before human society. And the best part of it is all our reports and the summary for policymakers have to be approved word by all the governments of the world. And I can tell you, that's not a picnic. I mean, this was approved a little over a month ago at the beginning of November by all the governments of the world, and I have to chair that session and make sure that each single objection is dealt with in such a way that by consensus all the governments accept it. So at the end of the day, what we have is a summary for policymakers which has the ownership of not only the scientific community and all the rigor that goes with the scientific assessment of climate change, but it also has the ownership of the governments of the world. So we now need to move on, and we do not have a moment to spare. I think if the world really is serious about dealing with this problem, then we have to get started immediately. Otherwise, the feasibility of dealing with climate change will become so difficult that we may not be able to manage the challenge. And the costs of taking action will become so high that they would go certainly beyond the range that we can afford. So the time for action is now, and again, I repeat what Mr. Prashant Bhushan said, it is for institutions like this to take the lead. And I've decided that I'm going to mobilize the youth all over the world, because I think that's where the hope lies. And why I'm going to do that is because this is your future. You have so many years of living ahead of you, which it would be a crime on the part of the present generation to leave in your hands a world which has been polluted, which has a climate that clearly will not allow you to develop sustainably or otherwise. And therefore, I think it is for us to join hands. But you have to take the lead, and I think you can make a difference, and I leave you with this appeal. Thank you very much.
So your plans to make youth your ally, Dr. Pachauri, in your, in climate action, because really, what better force and power today than that? Humans are indeed changing the climate, and thank you so much, Dr. R.K. Pachauri, for sharing your thoughts on how ambitious mitigation is indeed affordable.